So my name is Esther Wagner. I'm the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute. And I would like to welcome you all to the second seminar of our Binging Religion series, which we started last week with a seminar on unorthodox. And I can see by the name appearing on my screen here that quite a few already were there on our previous session, or even the sessions before on bringing the shrine home. Welcome back to you all, and I also see quite a few names I haven't seen before. So welcome to all the newcomers for joining us for the first time. For those of you who don't know these webinars and who are not yet familiar with the Wolf Institute, we are a research institution focusing on religion and society. And we combine our research with teaching, with public education, with policy work, and all this to foster understanding between people of different beliefs and no belief. Part of our work deals with the fact that religion in secularized Western Europe is not really part of our daily life. And this is very much in contrast to the rest of the world, especially the global South, where large majorities of people identify as religious and where religion dictates most parts of life. There's an estimate by the Pew Institute that 84% of people in the world identify as religious. So for us here at the Wolf, seeing a rise of programs on Netflix that focus on religious communities is something that caught our attention. And in our webinar series, Binging Religion, we focus on the relationship between faith and society through the exploration of various Netflix series and films. And this week, we're focusing on The Two Popes. Two Popes is a biographical drama. The film follows the rise of Pope Benedict XVI and his attempts to convince Cardinal Bergoglio to reconsider his intention to resign as an archbishop. As the film develops, the complex relationship between the two men is revealed, and the film climaxes when Pope Benedict confides Bergoglio of his own intention to abdicate the papacy. So on the panel with us today, we have Gemma Simmonds, who is a sister of the Congregation of Jesus, an honorary fellow of Durham University and past president of the Catholic Theological Association of Great Britain. In addition, Gemma completed her doctorate in theology right here in Cambridge, and she's been on various panels with us. I'm very, very pleased to have you back, Jenna. And our second panelist is Dr. Philip Cunningham, who's a professor of theology, specializing in Christian Jewish relations. And he's also the director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Each speaker will present in the customary Wolf 6 minutes. And after that, we'll have a 25-minute Q&A session. And again, as for those of you who are new, you can type your questions in the little Q&A portal on your screens. Please don't type them in the chat, because it's easier for me if I don't have to switch between chat and Q&A. In the chat, you can send little messages to the panelists and also to each other. But the Q&A panel is there for the questions. So I'm handing over to Gemma to talk to us about her impressions of The Two Popes.
So thank you. I loved the film. I think it's a very imaginative way of trying to deal with some very big issues. The film does something that originally looks a little bit obvious, in that it sets Pope Benedict as kind of the arch conservative, and it sets Bergoglio as the cuddly liberal. But of course, as the film unfolds, it becomes very, very clear that neither of those labels sits easily with either man. And we live at a time when there is a lot of polarization within the Catholic Church, a lot of polarization of positions. And certainly since the time of Pope Benedict's resignation and abdicacy of the papacy, there have been all sorts of attempts to pit one pope against the other. And it says a great deal both for the integrity and the intelligence of both men, that they have resolutely refused to allow themselves to be parked easily into a partisan or an ideological framework. It's certainly true that Pope Benedict would be theologically and I would say pastorally much more conservative than Pope Francis, but it's not the action of a hardline conservative to change the whole structure of the papacy. And I think one of the most fascinating things that Pope Benedict did in his time as Pope was precisely to end it. He's done an extraordinarily generous and prophetic thing within the church. Although it was for many people a sign of self-sacrifice, a sign of Pope John Paul II, as it were, aligning himself with the crucified Jesus to see an old and sick man continuing in his obligations, in his duty until his death. In all sorts of ways, it was quite problematic for the church to have a pope who was not functioning fully well for a very long time. And it seems to me that one of the implicit things that Pope Benedict was saying in his resignation was, actually, there are other models of authority. And certainly this is a film that's about authority, and it's about the way that ordinary people view authority. So we have the question for Pope Benedict of, how do I use my authority? How do I use it well? And there are clearly tensions behind that question. Bergoglio questions some of the ways in which authority has been used in the Benedict papacy. But then when we go into Bergoglio's own life story, we look back at the terrible time of the junta, of the military dictatorship of Argentina, and we see how he actually used his authority in ways at the time he passionately believed were right. He was trying to look after his own men. He was in charge of the Jesuits in Argentina. And history judged him very harshly in hindsight, particularly with regard to two of his confreres who were arrested and tortured. And so he has to face the question, how do I use authority? How have I used it in the past? How do I use it in the future? So this question of authority is really key to the film. But it's also a question of how the people of God view the authority of their leaders. And certainly it's true of, I would say, the Francis papacy, that he has deliberately shied away from being the kind of daddy pope, the authoritative pope, who takes decisions on himself. He's constantly putting authority back into the hands of ordinary Catholics and saying, you must discern this, you must make decisions. So it's a film about authority. It's also a film about discernment. And of course, for Benedict, and between them both, the terrible question comes up of the way in which the papacy dealt with the ghastly question of sexual abuse of children. That's a massive question, not only in the Christian church, not only in the churches, but in all sorts of structures of authority, both secular and religious. And it's a very interesting question to come up. In the film, it's very much simplified. And I think what the film isn't able to get across is the complexity of questions of authority, accountability, and responsibility. It can't show the full complexity of these questions, but the fact that it raises them and raises them in quite raw human ways, I think is part of the strength of the film. And in that respect, I found it not only an enjoyable film, but a very provocative and challenging film.
Thank you very much, Gemma. And I'm handing over to Philip.
Well, thank you. Good morning or good afternoon now, everyone from Philadelphia. I want to thank the Wolf Institute for inviting me to participate in this discussion. And I want to thank Gemma for for the remarks that she just offered. We have not coordinated our remarks or sort of combined them in any way. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack, but I think we're saying many of the same things and making very similar observations. So I look forward to the discussion. What I'd like to do is to offer 4 opening observations about the film, and I'll do that using a few still images from the film in order to sort of accentuate the points that I want to make. So let me share my screen. And I hope people are seeing an image of the 2 lead actors in the film. So my first point is that The Two Popes is not a historical depiction of the actual relationship between Joseph Ratzinger and Jorge Bergoglio. As Gemma said, it's rather an imagined interaction between these 2 Catholic leaders. It is, as they say, quote unquote, inspired by true events. And the true events are the extremely unusual situation of a pope resigning and then being succeeded by someone, quote, from almost the ends of the earth, end quote, as Francis put it on the night of his election. There's no evidence that Bergoglio wrote to Benedict about wanting to retire or that Benedict shared with him in advance his decision to resign the papacy. The conversations that the film portrays between them, including the moving climactic scenes of their mutual confessions to each other, did not occur. Second point, of the 2 principal characters, and Gemma said this as well, the film devotes much more screen time to Jorge Bergoglio than to Joseph Ratzinger. We learn far more about the life of Bergoglio through frequent flashbacks than we do about Ratzinger. The film's director, Fernando Meirelles, explained in an interview, quote, that the movie was supposed to be called The Pope and to be centered on Francis's story. But in the final months, the name was changed, end quote. And so as a result, Bergoglio comes across on the screen as a more fully formed character, whereas Ratzinger often seems one-dimensional and, well, crotchety, whereas visitors have described him in person as charming. Third, sometimes the film exaggerates the differences between these 2 historical characters in order to contrast them more vividly. We can see this when Pope Benedict exclaims to Cardinal Bergoglio during their secret meeting at Castel Gandolfo, "I don't agree with anything you say," he exclaims. Or when Bergoglio declares, quote, "We are moving in directions I can no longer condone," end quote. In actuality, the 2 prelates agree on quite a lot. Either of them, for example, could have written the following, quote, "More than ever, it is important that numerous Christians become involved in the struggle for justice, freedom, and human dignity because of their love for the disinherited, oppressed, and persecuted brothers and sisters. More than ever, the Church intends to condemn abuses, injustices, and attacks against freedom wherever they occur and whoever commits them. She intends to struggle by her own means for the defense and advancement of the rights of humankind, especially of the poor," end quote. As you might expect, this was written by Joseph Ratzinger in 1984 as prefect of the Congregation of the Faith, the Doctrine of the Faith, in a warning against the use of atheistic Marxism that some liberationist theologians were employing. But he also wrote, quote, "Those who want to respond generously and with an authentic evangelical spirit to the preferential option for the poor." Fourth and finally, all of this being said, the film can also be seen as a meditation on 2 Catholic ways of theologizing. Setting aside the film's tendency to oversimplify or even a caricature, there is some basis for presenting Ratzinger as a crusader for, quote, "one unchanging eternal truth," end quote, as Anthony Hopkins says several times in the film, and for depicting Bergoglio as fearing that, quote, "the Church is no longer part of this world," end quote, as Jonathan Price declares. Ratzinger lived much of his time as an academician, devoted to the life of the mind. and he used his intellectual gifts while head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Rooted in a certain kind of philosophical theology, his writings often critique, quote, Western relativism and permissivism, end quote, as the film put it. Thus, he has stressed that, quote, the church is a sacrament, a sign and instrument of intimate union with God and unity of the entire human race. She is therefore the sign and instrument of the kingdom of God, end quote. Bergoglio, on the other hand, became viscerally immersed in the lives of oppressed people. It's no wonder that as Pope, he has said, quote, I see the church as a field hospital after a battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds, then we can talk about everything else, end quote. He prefers a theology from the margins that criticizes consumerism and wealth inequality. He thinks that the centers of power in the church and in the world must be enriched by the perspectives from the peripheries. Importantly, neither Benedict nor Francis would disagree very often with the substance of what the other has written, though I can imagine them being pretty impatient with each other's styles, so to speak. Their difference in perspectives, in my opinion, ought not to be mischaracterized with the distorting labels of conservative or liberal. Both are profound theological thinkers, but they theologize in different ways and with different emphases. So to conclude, I think that the two popes performs a very valuable function. It can encourage viewers to reflect on their own worldviews and priorities, and particularly in this time of social polarization, ponder how different perspectives can enrich each other. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you very much, Philip and Gemma, for your panels. And I now invite you all to type in questions, and we actually have the first question already. David asks, in light of the experience since Benedict's abdication, has papal abdication proved a useful precedent for popes to come? Are two popes one too many? Who would like to go first?
I'll yield to Gemma for.
Gemma?
I would say no. You know, there are not two reigning popes. There is a Pope Emeritus, Pope Benedict, who has kept extremely carefully to a line of saying, I no longer hold that office. And it's really important, I think, to disassociate the office from the person, which is what he did by resigning. All sorts of people have constantly tried to lure him into taking that office back up again, at least implicitly, by making statements. Usually what they want is statements contradicting Pope Francis, and he's been extremely careful not to do that. So in that respect, I think that with great integrity, Pope Benedict has shown that it can actually be done, that the person and the office can be separated, and that the office can be laid down for the good of the church, which is why he did this.
So I'd like to add 2 points or respond in 2 ways to this question. First, a way of looking at the question would be, what will Pope Francis do someday? Will Pope Francis, following the precedent of his predecessor, resign if he feels his health is not enabling him to do the job he would like to do? I have a feeling he would. I have a feeling that Benedict has established a precedent now, and God forbid if Pope Francis were killed in some kind of an accident or something, then I suspect his successor would probably also now have that option of abdicating or resigning under the circumstances. So I think that legacy of sort of staying in on the papal throne until you keel over, I suspect that has probably passed. Second point, though, is a little, to me, a little more interesting, I think, and that is when Benedict made his decision to retire or resign, as Gemma implied in her comments, there had to be several decisions made that no one had faced for a long, long time. And one was, what will we call the Pope that has retired or stepped down? And the title of emeritus pope has emerged. Well, what should he wear? And there was a decision that made that Benedict should wear the white robes that he wore while Pope. And that gives rise to the scene of seeing two individuals wearing more or less identical clothing and not quite sure, you know, unless you saw the difference in age or height or something, you know, who was the Pope and who was not. And I could imagine that that decision to dress identically with the reigning Pope could change with Francis. I have a feeling Francis would probably opt a bit differently there.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I think you're right. I think Pope Francis would get on the first plane back to Buenos Aires for a start. And you know, in that respect, I think there's a question of the style. But I also think possibly that Pope Benedict was trying, at least originally, in retiring as he has, to make sure that he put a barrier between him and the public, so that he withdrew from the public eye. And I think there are many different ways of doing that, you know.
Thank you. Can I invite the audience to ask a few more questions? We have few questions so far. I can't see the Facebook questions at the moment, but we have hardly any questions on the Q&A. So please do type your questions in. Can I ask, what has been the reaction of Catholic communities to the movie? Especially sort of more conservative part of the community. How do you yourself feel about the portrayal of basically the sort of the highest leaders of your church?
Well, certainly one thing that very much struck me, you know, there's a moment where in the film Pope Benedict makes his confession to Bergoglio, and he just begins, and there's a sort of look of kind of dismay and horror on Bergoglio's face, and then it all goes silent, so we never hear his confession. But what we do hear at the very beginning is him naming Bishop Maciel, who was, Maciel was the founder of one of the ecclesial movements in the Roman Catholic Church, the Legionaries of Christ. He was disgraced, and he was discovered to have not only, he was accused of sexual abuse of seminarians, but also of having all sorts of illicit other relationships and having a very illicit relationship with large amounts of money. And at one point, so that's the name that comes up in the film, and you see Bergoglio looking more and more horrified. And when the sound comes up again, he says to Pope Benedict, you knew all this, you know. And it seems to me that it's implied in the film that somehow Pope Benedict was negligent in that respect. But in actual fact, this man, Maciel, was removed from office within the first months of Benedict's papacy. I mean, it's one of the things that he moved on fastest. And one very much got the impression that this was something that he had been wanting to do for quite some time. Now, it is known that accusations against Maciel came across the desk of Cardinal Ratzinger, as he then was, when he was head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And people accused him of doing nothing. But it is also known that Pope John Paul II, who, in my personal opinion, was not always the best judge of character, actually protected Maciel. And here was an instance of Pope Benedict, once he became the Pope, using his authority to make a definitive move against somebody whose behavior was, in his eyes, unacceptable. So I think that's one of the moments where the film is really very unnuanced in its treatment of Benedict, because although many people have accused him of not having done enough about the sexual abuse scandals within the church, here is one instance where he took issue with a man who was very, very powerful in the church for all sorts of reasons, and really acted fast. And you know, it's a question of looking at Pope Benedict with more nuanced eyes than I think people are generally inclined to do. And I would like to think that people could be open and generous in their judgment of him in that respect.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment, if I might, and that's in respect to the film itself. As Gemma said, the reference to Maciel happens as Benedict is about to give what becomes his confession to Bergoglio. We have, again, I just want to stress that we have no indication that any such conversation ever occurred, and that the structure of the film suggests to me that in exploring the biography of Bergoglio and the reasonable supposition that, because he said so, that he was conflicted about what happened in Argentina during the rule of the dictators and all of that, that the writers needed to have a sort of counterbalancing thing that Benedict could confess in order to dramatically tie the film together and to balance it off. But and you know, this is a reasonable topic that one might imagine that Benedict had doubts about and concerns about, but we really don't know that for a fact.
No.
Thank you. You've now had a flurry of questions come in, so I'll start reading the first one. Sandra asked, even if it is not his intention to contribute to the divisions in the church, Benedict has a large following of Catholics who are very vocal in their criticism of Pope Francis. Could you please share with us how you see this division? Is it endangering the unity of the church?
But,
No.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Philip, you go.
Okay, so this is a subjective response, but my feeling is that yes, there is a division within the church, and the figures of the two men sort of, or the stars that the different positions orbit around in conflict with each other. I believe that there is also an enormous influence from the polarization in the political world at large. And that plays a huge role that I have no way of measuring, and it's going to play out differently in different countries because the natures of the political divisions in countries are not identical. And that's why I was hesitant in my remarks to use the labels liberal and conservative, because that can mean so many different things in so many national contexts. And within the church, you know, you'd have to deal with, well, which topic are we talking about, and how does it play out for each of the individuals? I also think, in particular, because of the reason maybe that Gemma had said earlier, that Benedict did assume, it doesn't always seem to be perfectly observed, but did assume an out of public role, and that he wouldn't be making comments on everything that his successor did, which was a wise decision. But I do think there were people that manipulate his memory or his writings to advance a certain view of the church that Benedict himself would not agree with.
Yes.
And that's part of the drama of this unprecedented situation playing itself out.
I would absolutely agree with Philip there, and say, you know, if you go into the Catholic blogosphere, it's like swimming in a septic tank. Yeah. It's absolutely revolting. I find it, as a simple Catholic, deeply, deeply distressing. And as a Catholic theologian, I find it stupid, short-sighted, manipulative, and profoundly dishonest. So, you know, there are people out there in the Catholic blogosphere who give themselves very grandiose titles like, you know, protector of the faith or protector of the Pope. You think, actually, mate, the Pope doesn't need protecting, certainly not by people like you. And more than anything else, it would seem to me that they're trying actually to protect one particular stance that they have decided to stake their life on for whatever reason, totally ignoring everything else that any of the popes, whether it's Benedict or Francis, or indeed John Paul II, who is the great patron saint of so many of these groups. But if you look at the nuanced writings of Pope John Paul II, as well as of Benedict, as well as of Francis, they are all of one voice on some very, very essential issues. So, you know, from my position, yes, I would see there are major divisions, but these are divisions that actually any person who's got, you know, a big enough heart and a big enough mind to try and embrace what the Catholic Church is trying to teach would just simply ignore, because they're not worthy of respect, and they're not worthy of our wasting attention on them. That's it. Anyway, that's my personal view, so there you go. That's a strongly worded view, but I'm going to say it. I don't often get the chance, so I'm going to say it now.
Very good. Thank you, Gemma. Yael asks, in the film, Francis refuses the pomp of the papal robes, refuses to live like a bishop, as it's put in the film. Benedict sees this as a critique. Does religion not need some kind of mystique, symbols, clothes that inspire awe and that encourage continuity? What do you think about that?
May I answer that, because it's so much on my mind. Absolutely it does. And I don't know about you, but if I don't know if you watched the recent Urbi et Orbi message that Pope Francis gave to the world on an evening in March when he knelt alone in St. Peter's Square in the pouring rain. You know, you saw an old, and he is a sick man, suffering. You really saw it. And, you know, the mystique of that, the power of that image of the Pope kneeling there, and you felt as if he was holding the whole pain of this COVID virus on his own shoulders on behalf of the world. I don't think you need pomp and ceremony to make a clear image and to make a clear message. He made a message, all right.
We have a question. So, do you want to add something, Phil, or?
Well, maybe we should hear more questions, but I just one or two sentences. I would say that yes, I think Francis is sincerely, in his heart of hearts, has become, and probably always was, but certainly now is an extremely humble person. And he doesn't like frippery. He doesn't like the trappings of the monarchy that had accreted over the papacy for years. And for many Catholics, I feel they came to identify the papacy with a monarchical form of presence in the world. And in fact, there were whole movements in the church in the late 19th century to ratchet up the sort of imperial authority of the Pope. That is something that is anathema to Francis, and he has shown it right from the get-go, and the movie shows it by using shoes as the sort of medium of getting this message across. So I guess the question I would pose back to the questioner is, how is a religious authority in the Catholic community that is following in the footsteps of the carpenter from Nazareth best to be lived out?
Thank you, Phil. I have a very short factual question here. Who acts as confessor to a pope?
He has his own confessor, does he not, Phil?
Yeah, I do not know the gentleman's name, but each pope has a confessor that they regularly engage in in a kind of pastoral counseling sacramentally with.
Okay, another question from Cecile. When Pope Francis resigns or dies, are there candidates that would be able to continue the reforms at the Vatican and pursue a more inclusive, more Catholic universal church?
So I also saw there was a question about is there politics in the election of the Pope? Somebody had raised, and
yes.
The answer to that question is yes. And the answer to the current question that we just heard is yes. There are cardinals whom Francis has appointed, as well as some who had been appointed earlier, who come from different parts of the world. there are articles that have been written that have analyzed the sort of geographic distribution of the cardinals that whom Francis has elevated to the College of Cardinals. And it is going to be a much more international conclave that elects the next pope than was the one that elected him. What impact that will have on the individual who will assume the throne of Peter after Francis, we'll have to see. But it will be an interesting thing to view.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, it will. And you know, my immediate answer to Cecile's question is, I hope so. I hope we will have a pope who will continue with Francis's reforms. I think going back to one of the things that Phil was talking about, the kind of accretion over the centuries of the monarchical side of the papacy, I think the danger is not so much the individual pope himself wanting to have all these trappings. The terrible danger is the people who surround the pope. Mm. And, you know, the one thing it's very, very clear that Pope Francis has been trying to do is to clear out some of the hangers-on in the Vatican, to clear out what I would call the Vatican apparatchiks, the people who are kind of feeding on the sharks, you know. And these are people who get a huge amount out of the prestige and the money, if necessary, and the trappings and everything else that being close to the Vatican gives them. My sense is that actually Pope Benedict very badly wanted to deal with some of this and did what he could. And I suspect that part of his resignation was his realization that it needed somebody with different kinds of energy to actually deal with this. But, you know, it's very, very hard to change a system. It's very hard to change a system. And Pope Francis has not entirely successfully changed the system. He's done as much, I think, as he possibly could. But one gets the impression from things that he says, you know, when he said that he preferred a church that was bruised, hurting, and dirty from being out in the streets than one that was kind of safe and self-confined. He has given some of the sharpest critiques, not of the papacy, but of the church itself, of the whole apparatus. And you get a sense of a man who wants to shake it right down to its roots. But it's very hard for one person to change a whole system. There have to be a lot of people within the system who also want the system to change. And, you know, it's one of the reasons why I pray that he stays healthy and alive for as long as he can. But I also pray that his successor will also see the need to change the system, because the system is sick. There's no doubt about it.
Just to augment Gemma's last comments there, in my opening remarks, I kind of tried to contrast Ratzinger and Bergoglio by the isms that they oppose. And so Ratzinger is opposed to relativism. They're both opposed to consumerism. And for Francis, particularly in the first years of his papacy, but still to the present, the ism that he opposes within the church is clericalism. And he constantly is critiquing that aspect of church life, very much in accord with what Gemma just said.
One of our viewers sort of describes that she enjoyed the movie, but she had the feeling that the movie is avoided some of the most important issues of the papacy and Roman Catholicism, for example, homosexuality, relationship with the Jews. And another viewer, Ed, he asked, do you want to touch on attitudes to Jewish-Christian relations? Are they similar? Do they diverge between the two popes?
I would want to say, I mean, there is a moment in the film where when the character of Bergoglio kind of escapes and goes into a pizzeria to have a pizza, he talks about football and things to somebody he recognizes as being from Argentina. And the man, who is a stranger to him, makes a comment about Pope Benedict and says, well, of course, he's a Nazi. And you can see that there's a sort of visceral reaction of Bergoglio's against what he's just heard. But, you know, that is the whole question, I think, of the inheritance of the Second World War. is clearly something that is deeply, deeply important to Pope Benedict, because he lived it. And he lived it from the inside. And there have been many, many questions about his having been forced into the Hitler Youth as a boy and all of this kind of thing. And it seems to me that just as the whole question of justice and of the poor is viscerally important to Pope Francis because he lived it in the slums of Argentina, so the question of Jewish-Christian relationships is viscerally important to Pope Benedict because he lived the horror of what happened in his own native Germany during World War II. So I think every pope brings with him his own history and therefore his own personal baggage, but also the issues, the ideological and historical issues, which will never let go of him. And I think the question of Jewish-Christian relations never let go of Pope Benedict.
So I agree with what Gemma has said. Let me use these two questions to add another aspect or to say a little bit more. In terms of the topics of, for example, homosexuality and the child abuse crisis, et cetera, the film only touched on those as the questioner suggests. I suspect probably because, this is just a personal supposition, that the film writers and the producer and director and so forth were interested in showing the contrast between these two folks. And on some of these issues, they actually don't have much of a contrast in a theological sense. And so they had other texts that both of them have written and said to draw upon for making the contrast. But having said that, I want to use the topic of the church's understanding of its relationship to Jews and Judaism to underscore a point I made earlier, which is that each of the two men highlighted in this film have their own theological styles and their own ways of approaching the Catholic tradition on various topics. I think it's a mistake that I hear some people say that Pope Francis does not have the theological heft of Pope Benedict or Emeritus Pope Benedict. I think that's a mistake, and I think it is because folks have gotten so used to a certain way of doing theology that is heavily grounded in philosophical categories, whereas Francis does theology from the margins, as I said earlier. So on the question of relations with Jews, and I could go on ad nauseum for this, but just briefly, Benedict is certainly committed to Nostra Aetate. He is certainly committed to a positive dialogical relationship with Jews. Where his style of philosophical theology kicks in is when people describe Nostra Aetate, I think accurately, as a 180-degree turnaround in how Jews were spoken about in the Catholic tradition for the period centuries and centuries preceding Nostra Aetate. For Benedict, the continuity of tradition is a value that is important to him. And so he tries to write about Nostra Aetate as in continuity with what really is the true essence of what should be the church's understanding of its relationship to Judaism, even though the historical record contradicts that everywhere you look, anytime from the 19th century back to the 2nd, 3rd century. So Benedict wants to move forward. He has positive relationships with Jews. He's thought about the issues, but he emphasizes the virtue of continuity in the Catholic tradition. Francis, on the other hand, approaches the issue, of course he wants continuity too, but he also values the personal interrelationships that he has experienced that Benedict did not have in his own biography. And so for Francis, he wants solidarity, he wants friendship, he wants Jews and Catholics and other Christians, of course, working together to address the problems of the world. His priorities are on the relationship with living people today or between living people today, and less so on maintaining a continuity of tradition. That's not to say Francis wants discontinuities of tradition. It's a question of their emphases and how they they live out their lives in conformity with their preferences and priorities.
We have a hypothetical question. Is there any historical encounter from the history of the Catholic Church that you think would lend itself well to dramatization?
Wow.
Whoa.
Oh, I'll say one. I mean, the reason why I went, wow, I don't know if the mic was on me at that moment, but is because, I mean, there must be zillions of possibilities over 2,000 years. But here's one that I'll mention because it's been on my mind and the minds of my colleagues here at St. Joseph's for a while, and that is, I would love to see somebody dramatize the meeting of St. Pope John the 23rd with Professor Jules Isaac, which occurred 60 years ago on June 13th, 1960. This is a meeting where the French Jewish historian who lost family members during the Shoah did research on what he called the teaching of contempt that Catholics had promulgated for centuries. And he had like a 20-minute or a 30-minute meeting with John and said, would not it be a good idea, this isn't a direct quote obviously, but ought not the Church consider this question in the Second Vatican Council that you have announced is going to begin meeting in a couple of years. And according to research that has been done, particularly by somebody named Norman Tobias in a biography of Jules Isaac that came out last year or two, the question of putting on the Council's agenda the Church's teaching about Jews really had not been suggested by a whole lot of people up to that point. But yet after John had this meeting with Jules Isaac, he gave instructions for a subcommittee to be formed to look into this topic, and that directly led to Nostra Aetate and everything that has happened since in the subsequent 55 years. So both Isaac and John the 23rd, Angelo Roncalli, have interesting biographies. Roncalli rescued thousands of Jews during the Second World War by giving them fake baptismal certificates when he was an ambassador for the Vatican, for the Holy See. Jules Isaac was the head of the French Educational Office and wrote the curricular guidelines for history. So there's a rich story there that leads up to this 20-minute or half-hour meeting that literally has had huge consequences ever since.
Gemma, any other Netflix suggestions?
Absolutely. I would want to film an encounter between Catherine of Siena and, you know, the Pope of her day. Because Catherine was a woman, an uneducated, relatively uneducated laywoman who actually had an extraordinary transformative power within the structures of a very corrupt church of her time. And although many of her writings are firmly in support of the papacy itself and of the authority of the shepherd of the people of Christ, she's also very, very tough and very honest about the corruption of the bad shepherds. And for me, although I'm a huge fan, massive fan of Pope Francis, I would say that one of the areas in which I think he has made the least impact in the church is with regards to the role of women in the church. It's something that I think he from his own culture is just unable in some ways to face. And here in Cambridge, I work in the Cambridge Theological Federation in the Margaret Beaufort Institute, which is a Catholic institute for women, preparing them for service and for leadership in the church. The tragedy is that we see so many extraordinarily gifted and talented women who have so little space in which to use their gifts and their talents for leadership, because there is so little possibility for leadership within the church as it's currently constituted. So I would love to have seen a filmic version of Catherine of Siena going head to head with the Pope of her day. but also to see what that would actually bring up in terms of a genuine dialogue between women who see themselves as called both to service and to leadership in the church, and a church which has over the centuries and still now consistently failed to give proper space to actually listening seriously to the voices and experiences of women.
Thank you, Gemma. I'm afraid we're drawing to a close. We still have quite a few questions, but I'm afraid we're running out of time. So I apologize to those of you who asked questions we couldn't answer. There was one more question about where you can catch up on past webinars. You can just go to the Wolf Institute's web pages where all these things are stored, and you can also go to Facebook where you can also access the videos there. So I think I need to say a very, very heartfelt thank you to our wonderful panelists today, Gemma and Philip, and also to our communications officer, Tara Zamet, who, as always, was taking care of everything in the background. Thank you also very much for being a very good audience again, for asking all these very interesting questions. And I hope you will join us again next week for our next webinar on binging religion, where we will discuss the show Messiah. And check also for our other webinars. There are various different webinars that will come out in the next week. So please join us again, and keep well, everyone. Bye-bye.